Let's walk you through this really quick. Overnight, the president slaps 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports.
That continues against the president's tariffs from China, Mexico, and Canada. Also, businesses that say they'd be hurt badly as well, including those in the auto industry.
Federal agencies and workers across the country are now bracing for mass layoffs as the Trump administration moves into its next phase of its efforts to try to shrink the size of the federal government. Setting records right now, records like nobody has ever seen before. When you have companies like this coming in and almost 40% of their company in one signature is going to be devoted. The moment was electric, a thunderclap across the economic skies of North America. Mexico, long a cornerstone in the intricate lattice of global automobile production, had just done the unthinkable. It pulled the economic trigger on a move that in scale and intent was unmistakably strategic, severe, and symbolically potent. The newly elected U.S. President Donald Trump had barely concluded his inauguration celebrations before pushing forward on his campaign promise to rework trade relations. In particular, he announced a sweeping series of tariffs aimed at key trade partners, with Mexico positioned squarely in his crosshairs. What followed was swift, deliberate, and seismic, a coordinated counterstrike by the Mexican government that had the U.S. auto industry reeling. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. Mexico's response was not just a retaliatory measure. It was a calculated strike designed to strike at the very core of America's industrial might. Over decades, Mexico had grown into a critical hub for the manufacturing and export of vehicles and auto parts. U.S. car makers had become deeply entwined with Mexican factories, relying on the country's efficient labor force, competitive production costs, and close proximity. Engines, transmissions, brake systems, and thousands of other components moved across the border daily, feeding a just-in-time production model that was the envy of the world. With the sudden imposition of tariffs by the U.S., this delicate equilibrium was violently disrupted. But what truly staggered the U.S. economy was not the tariffs themselves. It was Mexico's retaliation. Rather than merely introducing counter-tariffs on agricultural products or consumer goods, Mexico strategically chose to target the very arteries through which America's automotive lifeblood flowed. First came an export restriction on crucial intermediate auto components. These were not just any parts. They were the ones that U.S. automakers could not easily replace or replicate domestically without years of retooling and billions in investment. Gear assemblies, precision electronics, and certain categories of high-efficiency engines were suddenly withheld or delayed at Mexican ports. Almost overnight, production lines in Michigan, Ohio, and Tennessee fell silent. Factory floor managers scrambled, supply chain executives panicked, and entire shifts were cancelled as warehouses ran dry. The move paralyzed an industry whose structure had evolved to depend entirely on seamless integration with its southern neighbor. Mexico, understanding the leverage it held, refused to flinch. This was not a bluff. It was a powerful assertion of sovereignty and economic self-respect. The Mexican administration, under intense pressure from its own political base and business community, presented its actions as a defense mechanism. For years, Mexico had participated in trilateral and bilateral trade pacts, playing by the rules and building a robust export economy. Trump's tariffs, seen by many as unilateral and hostile, had upended this pact. Mexico's counterstrike then was not just economic warfare. It was a message: interdependence cuts both ways. The U.S. auto industry, a pillar of the nation's manufacturing sector, found itself suddenly exposed. The disruption came at a time when many car makers were already navigating a shifting market. Electric vehicles, changing consumer preferences, and global competition had put pressure on margins. But nothing compared to this. Assembly lines ground to a halt, not because of a lack of innovation or demand, but because a sensor manufactured in a plant outside Monterrey no longer showed up on time. Dealerships soon faced shortages. Customers expecting a smooth rollout of the year's new models were met with delays and rising prices. Shareholders watched in horror as stock values of Ford, GM, and even foreign manufacturers operating in the U.S. took nosedives. It wasn't just American automakers that suffered. The extensive network of suppliers and subcontractors scattered across the Midwest faced existential threats. Small machine shops in Indiana that specialized in machining subcomponents found their backlogs drying up. Paint suppliers, tire manufacturers, and interior design firms that relied on steady demand from the big three automakers suddenly had no contracts to fulfill. Logistics firms, which had built sophisticated cross-border transportation corridors, saw a dramatic drop in activity. It was a cascading failure, a chain reaction ignited by a geopolitical standoff and fueled by the intricate dependencies of modern manufacturing. The labor impact was immediate and brutal. Tens of thousands of auto workers were laid off or furloughed within weeks of Mexico's move. Labor unions, already strained by years of automation and offshoring, found themselves battling to keep entire plants open. In cities like Detroit and Flint, where the auto industry was not just an employer but the bedrock of the local economy, the ripple effects were devastating. Local restaurants, service providers, and housing markets felt the shock. It wasn't long before mayors and governors began to pressure Washington for solutions, but the political environment was already polarized and increasingly adversarial. Mexico, for its part, managed the situation with remarkable discipline. The government set up contingency plans to support its own affected industries and workers, but the broader tone was one of resilience. Mexican officials made repeated public statements that emphasized their willingness to negotiate, but only on fair and reciprocal terms. In media appearances and diplomatic communiques, they framed their actions not as antagonistic but as protective, a shield raised in the face of a hostile tariff regime. Their stance garnered sympathy from international observers, many of whom had concerns about rising protectionism in the U.S. under Trump. What made Mexico's counterstrike so effective was its surgical precision. Rather than carpet bombing the entire trade relationship, the response was designed to maximize disruption with minimal collateral damage to other sectors. Agricultural trade, tourism, and other collaborative efforts were left largely untouched, preserving some channels for dialogue and cooperation. But the auto sector, so emblematic of North American economic integration, was turned into a battlefield. It became a symbol of the fragility of globalization in the face of nationalist policy shifts. The economic models that had long supported North American trade assumed a degree of political continuity that suddenly vanished. For decades, NAFTA and its successor USMCA had created a framework where companies felt confident making long-term investments. Plants were built, supply lines mapped out, and joint ventures established based on the assumption that borders would remain open and tariffs low. Trump's tariffs shattered that assumption, and Mexico's response drove home the cost of that miscalculation. Suddenly, what had seemed like a well-oiled machine was revealed to be a house of cards. From a broader geopolitical perspective, the confrontation signaled a shift in the dynamics of U.S.-Mexico relations. For much of the 20th century, the power imbalance between the two nations was stark. But the 21st century had seen a new era emerge, one in which Mexico was no longer merely a junior partner but a vital participant in a deeply interconnected economy. The counterstrike underscored this evolution. It was not just a reaction, it was a declaration of economic agency. Mexico demonstrated that it could not only participate in global supply chains but could also disrupt them when its interests were threatened. Wall Street analysts and economic strategists quickly recalibrated their forecasts. The U.S. economy, already vulnerable from other brewing trade tensions, now had to absorb the blow of a self-inflicted industrial slowdown. Automakers began revisiting their production models, exploring reshoring options. But those changes could not happen overnight. The infrastructure, workforce training, and regulatory environment required to rebuild certain capabilities domestically were simply not ready. Mexico, through its bold and calculated maneuver, had forced the world to confront the real costs of protectionism. The message was unequivocal. In a deeply interconnected world, punitive actions invite consequences, and no economy, however large, is immune to the backlash it provokes.